Many majestic medieval castles and huge fortresses of the 17th–19th centuries grew on the site of ancient Roman fortifications. But what were the fortifications of ancient Rome in its heyday? Legion camps and defensive lines girdled the entire empire, protecting it from enemy invasions and playing the role of bridgeheads for offensive actions. But the fortifications, placed in the inner provinces, had more of a status than a defensive character. One of the most common types of ancient Roman fortifications was a field camp, designated by the word castra. There were stationary winter and summer camps, the latter usually built in the evening after a day's march. There is neither an exactly reproduced prototype of a permanent camp nor a standardized construction scheme characteristic of the whole empire. Even in certain regions of the empire, the evolution of fortifications did not follow the same path. In this video we will emphasize the common features that were characteristic of all ancient Roman fortifications. There were strict requirements to the location of the camp. It should be well protected from all sides, convenient for defense, as well as have a source of water. The basis of all Roman fortifications was a system: ditch, embankment, rampart. Often there were 2 and 3 ditches, which depended primarily on the degree of military threat. Initially, all fortifications on the borders were built with turf, earth and wood. With the gradual establishment of permanent legion positions, the construction of fortresses of brick or stone began. Old fortifications were often dismantled and new ones erected in their place. These structures were built throughout the empire and were very simple, the only innovation of the late Republic and early Empire being the raised bars on the gates. Permanent camps were usually built in a rectangular type, occasionally in the shape of a square. During the Republican era, the Romans built their marching camps in a square. The theoretical ratio of length to width was 3:2. Traditionally, the camp had 4 gates, which were placed in the walls and usually protected on the sides by rectangular or square towers. Initially, the towers were not placed outside the walls for flanking the attacking enemy, but only in time, when camps began to be built as permanent long-term fortifications, did this type of fortification become established. Typical for fortresses was the internal arrangement of corner towers. Pre-gate towers partially protruded beyond the fortress wall. According to many ancient authors, the construction of a camp began with the organization of its inner space. With the help of a special tool, the main roads dividing the camp into 3 parts were made. Along these streets, there were rows of buildings. A special building was placed on the praetorium, where banners and savings of soldiers were kept. A separate building for the chancery was allocated, next to which were the weapons stores. Most of the camp was occupied by dwellings. Closer to the central square were the houses of the officers. Centurions and soldiers lived in common 1-story barracks, divided into rooms. Each of them lived 8 people. On the edges of the barracks were placed more spacious apartments of centurions. The least comfortable dwellings were allocated to soldiers of auxiliary units and servants. In large camps, where legions were stationed, numerous structures necessary for daily life were built: hospitals, warehouses, workshops and baths. It is known that every large camp where a legion was stationed had workshops for the manufacture of weapons and bricks. Warehouses were primarily for storing food supplies and were used not only when the camp was besieged, but were also supply bases for the warring armies. Initially, several legions were concentrated in one place, but by the end of the 1st century they gradually dispersed. This was primarily political and prevented too many forces from gathering in the hands of one commander. It is more difficult to determine the areas of auxiliary camps because of the diversity of such units. Ancient Roman fortifications gradually formed a unified network, which laid the foundation for the creation of the limes, a system of communications and defensive structures on the borders of the empire. In the conquered provinces, strategically important objects were protected first of all: major roads, river crossings and urban centers. In addition, a chain of posts was created, from which the barbarians' movements were monitored. In the era of Flavius began large-scale construction of fortifications and the creation of a reliable system of border protection. At the same time stopped large-scale conquests on all fronts of empire, and military units received permanent places of deployment. Auxiliary cohorts and alas were stationed on the borders in fortified forts and camps at a distance of 8–10 kilometers from each other. Numerous roads along the borders ensured the rapid transfer of troops from one defense area to another. Legions were stationed in large fortresses and were called upon to conduct significant operations in enemy territory. On some parts of the border began to appear systems of earthen ramparts with palisades and ditches. Eventually they began to build them of stone. At the same time, wooden fortifications of legions and auxiliary units were rebuilt in stone. The most famous of these fortifications are the Germanic limes. From Bonn to Regensburg, the fortifications in Dacia and Lower Messia. The Germanic limes stretched along the borders of Upper Germany and Rhaetia for a distance of about 550 kilometers. Its main task was to deter Germanic tribes from attacking the strategically important area of the decumation fields. Wedged between the provinces of Upper Germany and Rhaetia, the unfortified territories posed a serious threat to the empire's interior. This problem began to be solved under Emperor Claudius, who erected a line of fortresses in the upper Danube River. A completely different defense system was formed in the east. It was influenced by other natural conditions. In Syria and neighboring regions, the Romans were confronted by the powerful Parthian state. Besides, it was possible to carry out military actions on the limited territory as the desert was a serious obstacle for the big army. Therefore all large battles took place in valleys of the rivers Tigris and Euphrates or on mountain plateaus. This situation determined a different strategy of placement of fortifications and armed forces. The defense was mainly focal in nature. In general, the ancient Roman fortifications were very simple and in case of a long systematic siege could hardly resist. In the defense of the main stake was made on the professionalism of the defenders of the fortress, as well as roads that provided a quick transfer of reinforcements. The Romans preferred to meet the enemy in the field, rather than hiding behind the fortress walls. Whenever possible, they tried to move the fighting to the enemy's territory, so Roman camps were intended not so much for defense as for the deployment of troops and storage of necessary supplies. Ancient Roman roads. Roman roads were originally built for military purposes. As the Romans explored the outskirts of their empire, roads played an increasingly significant economic role. They allowed the assimilation of significant territories and contributed to the creation of the Roman world. The first mention of Roman roads can be found in such a source as the Laws of the 12 Tables. This document established and regulated the size and legal status of roads. It was established that the road should be 8 feet wide on straight sections and 16 feet wide on curves. Owners of roadside property were required to fence the road unless it was paved with stone, otherwise travelers could move wherever they wished. The process of laying a road began with Roman surveyors marking the road. We have the names and drawings of some of the tools they used in their measurements. Gramma, an analog of the angle gauge, which allowed to draw perpendicular straight lines. Corabat, a device for determining the slope. Diopter served to set the direction of the object. In general, the Romans tried to make the roads as straight as possible, and at turns increased their width so that oncoming carriages could separate. Contrary to popular belief, which states that the construction of roads and other infrastructural objects in ancient Rome was done by slaves, this work was often done by legionaries. This is confirmed by numerous written testimonies and images on triumphal arches. Taking into account the peculiarities of the relief, Roman roads were not built according to a single plan. Even on one road there were usually sections with different quality of pavement. The methods of road construction were quite progressive even from the point of view of our days. First, a depression was dug in the terrain and drainage was done, and then paving began. Usually, locally sourced materials were used. Large stone blocks were usually placed in the base, followed by a layer of gravel and a final layer. The final layer consisted of sand, earth and small stone, which was well compacted. Paved paths were a relatively small part of the total length of the road system. A common feature of Roman roads was a curved surface that allowed rainwater to run into drainage ditches without being trapped on the surface. During the construction of roads, great attention was paid to the construction of river crossings. Numerous stone bridges of that era are well preserved. Often they are real works of engineering art. To simplify the determination of distances and orientation, milestones were placed along the roads. They were not placed at a certain distance from each other, as they are now. Usually these stones simply indicated the distance to the nearest settlement. The stones themselves were usually quite massive. Their weight could reach several tons, and their size could reach up to 4 meters in height. In addition to indicating distances, the name of the emperor, in whose reign it was established, was carved on the stone. In the course of construction, other infrastructure accompanying roads was usually created. Numerous post stations, inns and warehouses were built along the way. On every 10 to 15 kilometers of the road, the Romans tried to place a post station, where it was possible to change horses. For several small stations, there was one large one, where it was possible not only to change horses, but also to stop for the night. Usually there was also a tavern and a smithy. Roads were the skeleton of the ancient Roman state, linking parts of the empire, allowing you to quickly move troops to the right point and contributing to the economic expansion of the Romans in the conquered provinces. Roman legions often built roads even in enemy territories.